All right, y'all, I'm picking up where we left off on page 15, paragraph 2, right here with Clark. Clark squatted, cupping Seaman's face in his large hand. There's no finer breed for water travel than a Newfoundland, that's a fact, he said, looking closely at the big black dog. Clark ran his hand over Seaman's square head and his broad neck. He felt the dog's muscular legs and thick fur. His smile showed his approval. He's a sound, healthy creature, Meriwether. Steady and good-natured. I think he's just the dog for the journey. Seaman wagged his tail, and Clark smoothed the fluffy fur around the dog's ears. He's a big fellow, though. I'll wager he weighs as much as a man. It's a good thing he knows how to hunt for some of his own groceries. Lewis and Clark spent the next 2 weeks in Clarksville hiring more men. Word had spread about the expedition, and many young men were eager to sign on for the adventure. The captains chose hardy fellows who seemed willing to work rather than sons of wealthy families. They chose young men who were used to living outdoors, who seemed cheerful and easy to get along with. Finally, a group was chosen and the boats were loaded. On October 26th, the men pushed off. They headed downstream with the Ohio River current. The weather was fine. On November 11th, they reached Fort Massac, where they hired a woodsman who knew some Indian languages. They proceeded on. 3 days later, the group made camp at the south of the Ohio River, at a place where it flows into the Mississippi, and stayed there a week. Lewis wasn't feeling well. He had chills and a fever, and Seaman stayed close to him as he rested at the camp. But when the hunting parties went out to bring back game, John Coulter had permission to take Seaman. Lewis agreed. Yes, by all means, he said to Coulter. Seaman can use the exercise, and he's awfully good at retrieving game. Lewis stroked the dog's fur. Go ahead, Seaman. Seaman stood up, but hesitated, looking at Lewis. Go, Seaman, Lewis said, and pointed to Coulter. Go with Coulter. Seaman wagged his tail and ran off beside Coulter. As soon as he was feeling better, Lewis began teaching Clark to pinpoint their location by measuring latitude and longitude. The angle of the sun's shadow had to be recorded at midday, and at night, the position of the moon and stars was measured. The readings could only be taken in clear weather. Although making these measurements, it was difficult and time-consuming. It was important because the expedition would be going into lands that had never been mapped. As the explorers traveled westward, the captains returned. Map makers would be able to draw maps of the Northwest using the information and captains' written reports. The captains took the night measurements after their men had gone to sleep. They used a special instrument recording every few minutes on the hour or so. Lewis taught Clark how to identify the stars and to read the measurement. Together, the pair practiced, one calling out numbers and the others to record. During the evening practice sessions, Seaman lay beside Lewis and watched the captains' faces. These men were delighted by each other's company. They were so eager to begin their adventure that the excitement could be read in the tone of their voices, the set of their jaws, and the spring of their steps. Their mood was contagious. Everybody in the camp felt it, even calm-natured Seaman. On the afternoon of November 16th, Lewis left one of the men in charge of the camp and whistled to Seaman. The dog hopped into the, I forget how this is pronounced,
pirogue.
Hopped off into the pirogue. Clark pushed off, and the two captains rowed to the western side of the Mississippi River to record the river's width. They pulled the boat into the bank and hiked through the woods. When they approached a nearby Indian camp, some of the natives strolled over to chat. Seaman sat patiently at Lewis's side as they talked. One of the Indians held out his hand for Seaman to smell. The dog did not growl, and the Indian man patted Seaman. He nodded at Lewis and said, "Big dog." Lewis smiled. He was proud of Seaman, so he wanted to show off. "Watch," he said as he tossed a stick for Seaman to retrieve. The dog fetched the stick and sat at Lewis's feet. Lewis took the stick and showed it to the Indian. "No teeth marks," he said. displaying the smooth bark. The Indian nodded again. He pointed to a pile of pelts. 3, he said. 3 skins, good dog, we trade. All beaver skins, very warm, all 3 for 1 dog. The smile faded from Lewis's face, and he turned quite pale. No trade, he said. I brought this dog for our expedition. He's worth a lot more than 3 beaver skins. The Indian looked at the pile of pelts as if considering how many he should offer. No trade, Lewis repeated. He turned to Clark. Let's go. As the men strode away from the Indian camp, Lewis spoke in an edgy voice. 3 beaver skins? Did the fellow really think that I would take 3 beaver skins for my dog? Why, I paid $20 for Seaman in Pittsburgh. A man doesn't choose just any dog to take along on a voyage to the Pacific Ocean. Look at Seaman. He's a magnificent animal. As big as a calf and as dollous as a kitten. Strong, too, with powerful legs. He swims like an otter. Meriwether, please, laughed Clark. The men thought he was making you a generous offer. In his village, 3 beaver skins was probably a pricely payment for any dog. Seaman's not just any dog, Lewis continued, his words tumbling out. Did you see the way he handled himself in that village? Not so much as one growl. He never left my side, sat right down as patiently as a grandmother. Didn't bother the food cooking over the fires. Why, even ignored the village dogs. Clark threw his big arms around the partner's shoulder. Meriwether Lewis, I declare you would trade me before you'd part with that dog. Lewis laughed, his face turning pink. Well, I prize the animal for his qualifications for our journey. Of course you do, man, Clark said, chuckling. And while you should, but the Indian's offer was not an insult. In a way, he was complimenting your choice of a dog. Scene change. On November 20th, the men loaded the boats to continue to their journey. They pushed into the Mississippi River and continued the boats upstream, heading toward the mouth of the Missouri River. After making camp for the winter, they would be traveling upstream on the Missouri for most of their trip west. As soon as the boats turned upstream, the captains knew that they had underestimated their task. The boats were heavy loaded with supplies, and the river's current was swift. Although the men were strong and hardy, they were straining against their oars. Going against the current was so difficult that they had to take a zigzag course. They rowed the boats across the river, heading slightly upstream at each crossing, but the method was terribly slow. The boats only traveled about 1 mile upstream each hour. It was not long before Lewis turned to Clark and spoke in their grim voice. We're going to need more muscle on our expedition. We need more men. Clark nodded. He had come to the same conclusion. I know, but more men means we need more supplies. Yes, and more supplies means we will need more boats. And more hunters to supply us with more game, Lewis frowned. Clark watched Lewis's face. It's a good thing we discovered this now, Meriwether, he said calmly. Lewis nodded. He shook his dark mood. After all, throughout a rush, they were all about to begin the greatest adventure in history of the United States. That's agreed, then, Lewis said, clapping his hand on Clark's shoulder. We'll take on more men at the army post at Kasakia. No definition found. It's just the name of a place. So, guys, when you come to a word you don't know like this, try and pronounce it. I'm looking at it phonetically, and I would say Kasaskia. Now, if you find that too difficult, what I always tell my students in my class is look at the first letter and call it K. The expedition reached K on November 28th. More men were recruited. More supplies were loaded. A spot was chosen for winter camp at the mouth of the Missouri River. By mid-December, the men were building Camp Wood. At first, the winter camp bustled with activity. The men were busy sawing, hammering, and moving supplies. As soon as Camp Wood was complete, the men settled into routine. Lewis made trips to St. Louis to purchase more supplies, mail letters, and make arrangements. He and Clark talked with the traders and trappers who had been up the Missouri River. The captains sketched formal maps on their intended routes based on these conversations. Seamen went on hunting trips with John Colter. He ran beside the men on their training drills. Whenever York had time, he threw sticks into the river with seamen to retrieve. One of the younger men, George Shannon, wrestled playfully with him. Scene change here. By the middle of March, the Missouri River was free of ice. The days grew warmer and the men grew restless to begin their adventure. On the morning of March 31st, Lewis and Clark sat together looking over a list of names. Seaman dozed beside Lewis as the captains talked. When they got up and strode into the open area in the center of Camp Wood, Seaman trotted along next to them. The captains ordered the men to assemble seamen, watch as the captains announced the names of the men chosen to come onto the expedition to the Pacific Ocean. Each man stepped forward as the captains called their names. These men would be the main party of explorers, the Corps of Discovery. 26 men were chosen in the Corps of Discovery. 3 sergeants were announced: Charles Floyd, Nathaniel Pryor, and John Ordway. 9 of the men were from Kentucky, including John Colter and young George Shannon. 2 of the chosen men were brothers, 2 were cousins, and some were friends. A few of the men had been raised by Indian mothers and could speak few words of tribal languages. Some of the men had traded with the Indians and knew the sign language used by the tribes that lived along the Missouri River. The groups included men who were expert hunters, fishermen, and trappers. They were men who could run a blacksmith forge, build with wood, and steer a boat, and play a fiddle. That's an instrument, y'all. Kind of like a banjo. It is a banjo. Almost all of the men were in their late 20s or early 30s and unmarried, like their captains. The captains told the rest of the men, a smaller group, about 20, that they would go along the first part of the journey. The smaller group would return with the scientific notes and samples of plants and animals that they collected during the first leg of the journey. As soon as the announcements were finished, the men chosen to be the Corps of Discovery whooped with joy. They shook each other's hand and slapped backs all around. George Shannon raced over to Seaman and threw his arms around the big dog's neck. At 18, Shannon was the youngest man to be chosen. Seaman licked Shannon's cheeks, his tail wagging back and forth. Although York's name was not read aloud, Clark pulled his hand on the black man's shoulder and said that he would be part of the Corps of Discovery. York broke into a little jig, and John Colter grinned and clapped his hands. Barking happily, Seaman romped around the group. Lewis and Clark watched the merriment, beaming like proud fathers. As soon as Lewis and Clark expedition would begin. All right, ready for chapter 3.